So today we're going to talk about experimental research. And when we talk about it, in order to make meaningful conclusions, we need to have groups that we can compare. And in research, we use two types of groups. The experimental group gets the treatment or the manipulation. And in the science of psychology, the term treatment doesn't necessarily mean therapy or medication. We use the term treatment or manipulation when we're describing any kind of experimental manipulation. In our example, the experimental group is the group that gets the different kinds of rewards, and the control group gets no treatment or reward. The control group is the group to which we compare our experimental group, and if our independent variable, whatever that variable is that we manipulated, works, then we should see a difference between the groups. If there's no difference between the experimental group and the control group, we can conclude that the treatment was not effective. If both of them, the ones that received the treatment and the ones that didn't receive the treatment, have exactly the same or even really close to the same experience, then that means the treatment that the experimental group was not effective. So if there's a difference between the experimental group that got the rewards and the control group that didn't get any reward on the amount of time that's studying, then maybe the students just started to become more active later in the semester because they were more worried about their grades. So you have to have something to compare. And if we're looking at an example of depression, and there was no difference in the one that got the treatment and the ones that didn't get the treatment, then, or if they both showed improvement, then you just have to realize that, of course, most people who are depressed will improve over time. So it wasn't necessarily a result of the treatment. We mentioned variables in the first slide, and we've talked about them before, but let's revisit them in some detail here. There's two different types of variables that are included in experiments, and the first type is the independent variable, the variable that's manipulated. And you must have at least two levels in order to tell if you've actually made a difference with your independent variable. And then you have the dependent variable, and that's the variable that we actually measure. All manipulated independent variables must have a minimum of two levels. That is, at the very least, an experiment involves a comparison between two situations or conditions. So if we use an amount of alcohol consumed in reaction time as our experiment, then such a study would require at least two dosage levels, if you will, of alcohol in order to make a comparison. So the way this study would be described as an experiment is with amount of alcohol consumed as the manipulated independent variable, and dosage 1, which might be a 12-pack in 30 minutes, and dosage 2, which might be a 30-pack in 30 minutes. Do they even make 30 packs? As the two levels of the independent variable. So you could also say that this study has two conditions, which would be those two dosage levels. And what we know is that conditions, they can have more, a study can have more than two conditions or situations. And a good example of that is Latane and Darley's famous diffusion of responsibility study. They could have had a study where they just had two groups in order to make a comparison. They could have had a group of two for their experimental group, and then maybe a group of one for the control group. but they chose to go further and add some additional group sizes. And they also, by the way, could have just said, would they help or would they not help? Would the bystander help or would they not help? But they went a step further there too and looked at how long it took the bystander to help. So there is some distinct advantages to adding levels beyond those required 2 levels. In this study with Latane and Darley, you would look at the experiment and the number of bystanders would be your manipulated independent variable, and the response time of 2 bystanders, the response time of 3 bystanders, and the response time of 6 bystanders would be the 3 levels of that independent variable. We've talked about, in fact, up to this point, we've pretty much only discussed manipulated variables. Any experiment can be described as a study investigating the effect of X, if you want to get algebraic here, the effect of X on Y. And the X is the independent variable, something that is being studied to see if it will influence or change behavior. And we call that the manipulated factor because the experimenter or the researcher has complete control over it. However, the independent variables can also cover subject variables. And we haven't really talked about subject variables yet, but subject variables, which by the way are also known as ex post facto variables or natural group variables or non-manipulated variables or quasi-experimental variables, participant variables, and of course subject variables that we've already talked about. And that's the term that we're going to use in this course is subject variables. And subject variables are a type of independent variable that's commonly found in psychology research. The subject's age or sex or height, weight, socioeconomic level, I mean, they're kind of endless. Cultural group, race, intelligence, gender, physical or psychiatric disorder, and any kind of personal attribute that you can name. These are subject variables. They're not things that you can manipulate, so when you use a subject variable in a study, the researcher has to choose or select their sample or their groups for the experiment based on the characteristics that people already possess. So they're not a manipulated part of the research. To better understand the difference, let's look at a study that's been somewhat both ways. Well, at least a pretend study, okay? So in our example, we're going to go back and look at the effect of alcohol on reaction time. In our pretend study we talked about earlier, the participants would come into the study and they would draw a number to decide if they were going to be in the 12-pack group or the 30-pack group. And that selection would be totally random, just luck of the draw. However, if you're going to use a subject variable, on the other hand, to do the same kind of thing where you would look at the effect of alcohol on reaction time, you might select 2 groups that differed in a characteristic like weight. I mean, that would make a difference on the effect that alcohol had on people, I would think, would be their weight or their sex, male or female, whether they were drinkers or non-drinkers. So right now let's go with the males versus females example. So the first group then would be males and the second group would be females, because we know we have to have 2 conditions, right? And notice that the major difference between this situation and the one involving a manipulated variable is that with sex as a subject variable, when your volunteers come into the study, they can't be placed by random draw into either one of the conditions, right? Because what if they drew a number and they were female and they got placed in the male group? That wouldn't work. So they would be placed in a group because of attributes that they already had or possess upon entering the study. And there are some researchers, true to Woodward's original use of the term, that prefer to reserve the term independent variable just for variables that can be directly manipulated by the experimenter. But most others are willing to include subject variables as an example of a particular type of independent variable because the experimenter has some degree of control over them, just because of the decisions that are involved in selecting them in the first place, and because the statistical analysis will be the same in both cases. And in this class, we're going to use the term independent variable when we discuss subject variables. And the truth is, it really doesn't matter what you call them, except, we need to call them something, so much as that you understand the difference between a manipulated variable and a non-manipulated or subject variable, both in terms of how the groups are formed in the study and the information the types of conclusions that can be drawn from each type of study. And that's where the difference occurs. One of the goals of research in psychology is to discover explanations for behavior. We need to know what caused some behavior to occur. And with manipulated variables, conclusions about the causes of behavior can be made with some degree of confidence. With subject variables, we cannot say that one thing caused the other, so we can't prove causation. And of course, this is because the experimenter's level of control. With manipulated variables, the experimenter can meet the criterion required for demonstrating causation. And the independent variable precedes the dependent variable, has either a positive, a negative, or no correlation. And assuming that we don't have any confounds, we've talked about those before, then it can be considered that the most reasonable explanation for the results is the independent variable. And in other words, if you vary one factor and control all the other factors, the results can be attributed only to the factor that was varied. In a confound-free experimental study with two groups, these groups will be essentially equal, or any differences would be totally random in all ways except for the manipulated factor. And when you're using subject variables, that changes. The experimenter can also vary a factor, i.e. they can select participants having certain characteristics, but they cannot hold all else constant. There's just not a way to do that. So when you're selecting participants who are male or female, that doesn't guarantee equivalency within the groups in some other ways. So in fact, they might differ in a lot of ways: weight, normal drinking habits, or any other pre-existing conditions that could influence the outcome of the study. When a difference between the groups occurs in this type of study, we can't say the differences were caused by the subject variable in terms of the conditions for causality, although we can say that the independent variable precedes the dependent variable and shows some kind of correlation with it. But we cannot eliminate alternative explanations for the relationship because of the possibility of those extraneous factors which can't be controlled. When subject variables are present, all we can say is that the groups perform differently on the dependent measure. We can't say that one thing caused the other. Let's talk just a quick minute about controlling extraneous variables. An extraneous variable, as we know, is any uncontrolled factor that's not of interest to the researcher but that could affect the results. And we know that a confound is any extraneous variable that covaries either positively or negatively with the independent variable and could provide an alternative explanation for the results. So in our little subject experiment that we were doing there with the subject variables, if we said that we have the males and the females, but another confound might be that the alternative explanation for the results, assuming that the men could handle their liquor better than the women, might be that 100-pound woman, not that many of them weigh 100 pounds, but that's a nice even explanation. Probably would have a higher alcohol level in her blood if she drank a 30-pack than a 250-pound man. So another example might be distributed studying versus mass studying, like cramming for an exam. Dr. Starr, let's give another example. Dr. Starr wants to see how different types of music affect relaxation, so he has people listen to new age, country, or rock music for 20 minutes, and then he measures their level of relaxation. Independent or dependent? Dr. Starr believes that the experiment will be more realistic if the new age music is played at a low volume, the country music at a moderate volume, and the rock at a high volume. He finds that the group who listened to the new age music was more relaxed, and the group who listened to the rock music was least relaxed. So low volume may have been more soothing and not the new age variety of music. So your confound would be, was it the type of music or was it the volume level of the music? I've got a web link that it should be posted below where you saw this lecture section, and I want you to view some examples of the things that we've talked about so far. In particular, whether or not you're studying and testing what you mean to be, or if there might be some confounds or extraneous variables.